Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Lubar Center at Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Amy Goldstein. She is a Washington Post reporter, just about ready to celebrate her 30th anniversary at the Post, she told me earlier. She covers social policy for the Post. Right now she's covering the healthcare debate, so we're lucky that she has time to spend with us today. There are a few things going on regarding healthcare in America right now. Amy's also been part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2002 for the Post, and she is the author of this book. It came out earlier this year. It's called Janesville, An American Story, and it is about the closing of the GM assembly plant in the city of Janesville back in December of 2008, and the impact that had on the city and on the people who live there. Won't you please welcome Amy Goldstein, Marquette Law School. Good to have you. This book has gotten great reviews. New York Times said it's eye-opening, it's important, and we're going to talk about what Amy found during her time in Janesville, and she spent a fair amount of time in Janesville. But I want to begin with a simple question about how this book came to be. How did you decide that the story of Janesville, the closing of this plant, should be its own story?
Well, during the Great Recession and afterwards, 2008, 2009, I was in my day job at the Washington Post covering a very broad social policy beat. And as part of that beat, I was writing a few stories about what I later learned were called recession effects, kind of the ground level view of what difference it made that the economy was in such bad shape. So I did a story out of Florida about people who were falling out of the middle class and onto the welfare rolls. Did a story out of South Carolina about the strains on the nonprofit parts of the social safety net, places like food pantries that were just slammed with new customers and didn't have enough money coming in because there were few people who had disposable income to donate to charities. And these stories kind of sensitized me to what was and was not being written at the time about the bad economy. And what I started to notice was that there were a lot of good journalists who were writing about the political fighting over then pretty new President Obama's economic policies, about the banking industry, about whether the auto industry should have gotten a bailout. And I wasn't seeing many stories about the effects of this bad economy on ordinary people who were losing their jobs. And that seemed to me a very important story that should get more attention. So that was the genesis of all of this.
I want to lay the foundation for the discussion today. There are very intimate portrayals of the people of Janesville in this book. And we'll talk more about some of their lives in just a moment. But help us understand the kind of city Janesville was before the plant closed, before December of 2008. What was Janesville like, and what was the role that GM played in Janesville?
Well, Janesville is a pretty small city, obviously in southeastern Wisconsin. Its population has been pretty stable for a while, 64,000 people. It's a pretty Democratic-leaning town because of a lot of union members in town. And General Motors was one of two big economic engines that really drove everything else about the economy. Parker Penn had started in Janesville in the late 19th century, and it was going. And then in 1919, just after World War I, a guy who was running a local farm implements company went to General Motors, president at the time, and persuaded him to start making tractors in Janesville. So tractor production started in 1919, and the plant started making Chevys in 1923. So if you think about how many generations of workers that plant sustained until it closed 2 days before Christmas of 2008, you have all these multi-generational families who worked at the plant. And this was really the best working class set of jobs in town.
Good pay?
At the end, it was paying $28 an hour. So that was good pay, and good union benefits, good vacation. And one of the things I learned was that these benefits were so good that people got time off for hunting season in the fall, deer hunting season. So this long, stable set of good working class jobs kept the rest of the economy humming. because it meant that there were supplier companies, including one called Lear Seating that had, at the end, 800 workers all to itself, who were making seats in lockstep with the GM production. There were all kinds of other supplier companies that were, driving vehicles off the lot, were, powdered metal companies that were making little parts for the plant. I mean, all these other companies that were in that area of Wisconsin because the assembly plant existed. So you can imagine what happened when the plant closed. All this other work went away too. So it was this cascading effect of lost jobs.
We should mention too, Amy, and I think you talk about this in the book, that you found Janesville have a very can-do attitude, and there was a certain civility there. Yes, you had union members here and you had the company over there, but there was a closeness to that community.
That's right. I mean, like any community, there are people with different political points of view, but it was a pretty harmonious place. And I tend to think that, one of the conclusions that I came to through doing a lot of research about the history of the community, that the fact that you had these two local industrialists who started Parker Penn and who brought GM to town really imbued the culture with this kind of can-do spirit. And the fact that Parker Penn, by the beginning of the 20th century, was establishing international markets. And Parker Pens made in Janesville were being used to sign, World War treaties, really gave Janesville kind of an outside sense of its reach into the world. So I think it was a pretty resilient place. As you say, it was a place where people didn't all agree, but they got along. In terms of the union local, United Auto Workers Local 95 was Janesville's local, and the management, they had a reputation for being pretty congenial. That's not to say that over the decades GM workers didn't participate in strikes, but they
were not as bitter as some places.
They were not nearly as bitter as in some places. And over its last years, my sense was that the union really tried to work out arrangements with management for that plant to increase the odds that the plant would be able to keep going.
You mentioned that the plant closed 2 days before Christmas, but the word came that it was closing back in June of 2008. I think it was June 3rd. What was the reaction of the people in Janesville to this news? Did they believe it? Did they think that possibly GM might have a change of heart? How did they respond?
Well, I think it's important to remember that when that plant closing announcement came, a couple things. One, there had been rumors for so many years that the plant was going to close that people didn't believe it was going to happen. It had been just kind of a backdrop to, there'd been like this sort of stability, but this kind of undercurrent of maybe it won't last that had gone on for so long that people were just acclimated to that. So there was a lot of denial, I think, and that denial was helped along by the fact that initially General Motors said that the plant would close sometime within the following 2 years. It ended up closing by the end of that year, so it was much more precipitous than anyone believed. And even when the last day came, people did not believe that it was going to stay closed, because there had been a history over the decades of products coming and eventually products leaving and new products coming. So there was no precedent for people to imagine that this time might be different. I arrived in town for the first time midway through 2011. So it was a couple of years after all this work had gone away. And I remember the first person I met, who was a guy named Stan Milam, an old journalist in town, who at the time had a radio show and was working as an education consultant. I remember him saying to me on that first morning I ever was in Janesville, "You're going to hear people saying it's going to reopen." And I was like, well, it's been closed 2.5 years. I said, "You're going to hear it." And I did. And I remember going to the high school graduation of the daughter in one of the main families that we'll talk about, the spring of 2013. And the father in that family, the older generation, the grandfather of the high school graduate, rode up on his Harley for the commencement exercises at the high school and gave me a hug and said, "Just wait, it's going to reopen." That was in 2013.
Still believe it.
2013.
5 years later.
5 years later.
Still believe it. Interesting.
So it was a long time coming before people really understood that this was not going to reopen this time.
Yeah. I want to talk about and I have one thing I want to add to that, Amy. We should say the vehicles they were making at the end were the big Tahoes, right?
Yes.
And this was we're in the recession and people are saying we need fuel-efficient cars. They were making Tahoes. That's one of the reasons the plant shut down.
That's right. So the market for Tahoes had completely fallen apart. Gas prices were at $4 a gallon. There were 2 factories in the United States that were making Tahoes. One was in Texas, and it was a much newer plant. So it kept going, and Janesville closed.
Amy tells the story of what happened in Janesville in very personal terms. So she profiles a number of individuals here, and we're going to spend a little time on some of the people she met during her time in Janesville. Because I think each of these families we're going to talk about, Amy, represents kind of a different scenario in terms of how people responded to the plant closing. So I want to begin with the first family. This is the Whitaker family. And like so many families, there's a history here. Other family members have worked at the GM plant. The Whitakers, Jared Whitaker, his wife, 2 daughters, they struggled. This was not an easy transition for them to make after he lost his job.
That's right. And let me just say broadly that I appreciate your characterization of the differences among these families, because obviously there were many, many people I got to know in town, and many people who could have been the main, I mean, I feel funny saying the word characters, because these are actually real people who are living their lives now in Janesville, who are just very generous in sharing their experiences with me. But I tried to pick people, as I came to think of it, who made different kinds of choices when there were no good choices left. And the Whitaker family, as you say, they had a GM worker, Jared Whitaker, who was in his late 30s and had been at the plant for 13 years when it shut down. His father had been at the plant. His wife's father had been at the plant. They were retired on nice pensions, and Jared loses his job. And they've got 3 kids. And like a lot of people who worked at GM itself, unlike at the suppliers, I mean, the GMers, even though they're in the same union local, they always had a little bit better pay than the workers at the suppliers, and they had better benefits after the work went away. So they were getting what was called sub-pay, which was supplemental union pay on top of their unemployment benefits. And Jared just thought that he would cruise along on sub-pay for a while, and the plant would reopen. And it obviously didn't, and like a lot of people, he eventually went back to school, very briefly. He thought he would train to go into utility work, because the word on the street was that there were a lot of older guys working for the local utility company who were going to retire. Well, after a couple weeks in this course he's starting to take at Blackhawk Technical College, one of the state's technical colleges, the instructor asked the class to divide into groups of people and hammer in a wooden practice pole for them to climb up, about 10 feet tall. So Jared climbs the pole and loses his grip and slides down and sort of tears up his chest, and was just terrified and thought, you know, I can survive a 10-foot, slide down, but what if I'm on a real pole and I get hurt? How much good am I doing my family then? And he leaves school. So he then starts working a whole series of bad paid jobs. I mean, none are paying more than $12, $13, $14 an hour. Tammy, his wife, is working 2 part-time jobs, neither one paying a lot. And they, at this point, have their 2 daughters who are twins, named Alyssa and Kezia, who are in high school. And these are really bright kids. They're in AP courses. They're college-bound. Their teachers love them. And they start working, by their senior year, 5 part-time jobs between the 2 of them.
And that's to pay bills. They're just trying to keep the family from going underwater, right?
Yeah. They're paying for their own cell phones, but they're also slipping their parents money for groceries and electric bills, and that's how that family kept going for a while.
A quick aside to that, and this is one of the interesting things in Amy's book, this is sort of the other side of the story you don't hear as much about. So these kids who are really struggling, and at times it's very emotional for them, but they were hardly alone. There was, at Janesville Craig High School, there was a closet that they kept for kids who just needed basic supplies to get by.
Yeah, there are actually closets at both of the high schools. So the Craig one started eventually, but the original was at Parker High School. And an aside to your aside, yeah. I love that the 2 high schools are named for the 2 founding industrialists of the town, Parker for Parker Penn, and Craig for the man who brought General Motors to town. So you've got this sort of iconic industrialism built into the identity of the high schools. But back to your point about teenagers, one of the things that I learned out of getting to know people in Janesville is that falling out of the middle class is not like having been poor all along. And one of the ways in which it's very different, I think, is that people hide it from one another. So that the Whitaker girls did not talk to their friends about the fact that their family was struggling. And a social studies teacher at Parker High who founded the Parker Closet, very quietly, when she noticed that there were kids who seemed to be struggling, were coming to school a little dirtier than they had been or looking a little hungry in the mornings, she would sort of quietly tap them and say, I've created this little room with donated jeans and school supplies and shampoo if you need shampoo. And the kids who would come into this room for the first time were blown away. I remember Kezia telling me when we first started talking about this, that the thing that shocked her, apart from the fact that somebody was generous in her school to be collecting these donated goods, was that if this room existed, other families were having trouble too, and she had not known that before.
There were, one of the parts of the story that you tell is that there were actually quite a few kids who were, I guess you would call them homeless. They didn't know where they were going to sleep at night.
Yes, so when these middle-class jobs went away, people who had had middle-class jobs were scrambling for any job they could get, and they were taking jobs at gas stations and fast food places. So they were kind of knocking the lower working class out of work. So some of those people became unemployed and families became homeless, and some of their parents left town to try to find jobs elsewhere, left kids with relatives, or the parents, just had addiction problems because they were really struggling. And these kids were couch surfing. And a school system social worker whose job was to be the liaison to homeless children, homeless teenagers, particularly in Janesville, and a similar social worker in Beloit started collecting money to try to create housing for these unaccompanied homeless teenagers. And there was a film that was made, a documentary by a Beloit filmmaker that was called 1649. And 1649 stood for the number of hours and minutes from the end of one school day to the beginning of the next, with the idea behind that being that that was a long number of hours and minutes if you didn't have a stable place to live. And this film was made, and it interviews a couple of these homeless kids. They were like the stars of the show, these homeless teenagers, as a fundraising device. And when the Janesville social worker began showing the film in town, people were just shocked. I mean, they just could not believe. I mean, it was Janesville was so contrary to this community's identity as a pretty economically stable place.
I want to talk about another family, the Vaughn family. So some people in Amy's story, I guess you would say they tried to embrace the change that had been thrust upon them. How did the Vaughn family fare when the plant closed? Because they worked for the supplier you mentioned earlier, Lear.
That's right. So like all the families I focus on, the Vaughns were a multi-generation auto worker family. Dave Vaughn, who was in his early 60s when I first met him, was retired for General Motors. And he was actually the union local's vice president at the time because the union had no more auto workers to be running it. So retirees came back as volunteers to run the local. And I met him early on and I said, who else should I get to know in town? He said, well, you should get to know my son. He might not talk to you because he's a pretty private guy about what's going on. But we eventually met. And Mike Vaughn had been the shop chairman, the top union guy at Lear Seating, the biggest supplier. And his wife, Barb, had been at Lear. They met there. She had lost her job one shift before, so she had lost her job the summer of 2008. Mike was able to stay a few months after the plant closed because as the union leader, he was able to hang out at the plant while, and this was the Lear factory, while a vestigial corps of workers took apart the assembly line piece by piece. So he's watching over this period of several months the plant coming apart, trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life next. And he was applying for union jobs. And he was applying in a 3-state region for union work and couldn't find any openings that appealed to him. So he decided that he would follow his wife back to school. She was already retraining. And he tried to think about what kind of work he could gravitate towards that would make use of his union skills. And Blackhawk Tech at the time was opening a program in human resources management. And Mike thought long and hard about that, because if you think about that title, the last word is management, which is a hard thing for a hardcore union guy. But he eventually made peace with it. He decided that if he could help people from the union side, he could help workers from the management side. But there comes a point in the book where he has to tell his father what he's going to do. And you'll have to read the book to see what happens.
Oh, that's good. I like that. You know how to sell books. That's I'm impressed by that. It has a happy ending. So anyhow, but they were, today, I think you would say the Vaughns, they are in different work. It is paying considerably less than what they were making, which was about $22 an hour. But they feel, I think you told me, they feel sort of grateful.
They do. They succeeded at their retraining. Mike, about a month after he finished up, got an offer from Seneca Foods to do HR work on the overnight shift, making exactly half of what he'd been making before. But he felt that, he had found a new line of work. He had a horizon line ahead of him. He was able to stay in Janesville doing this work. Barb had trained to do criminal justice work, and it took her a few twists and turns before she found a kind of work that she felt like she was meant to be doing. But she eventually has ended up working with people with developmental disabilities, and she's an administrator. I should say that she had been a high school dropout. So for her, getting a high school equivalency degree and then getting an associate's degree was a really big deal, and she felt such a sense of accomplishment having done that. And she sort of looked back on her factory days, which were pretty hard on her body. It's just hard physical work, doing the work she'd been doing at Lear. And she has worked her way up to being kind of a low-level management at the organization for which she's doing this developmental disabilities work. She has a few clients that she's still directly supervising. They call her night, day, and weekends. And she feels like she's found a calling that she never knew she would have. And their pay is much less than it had been. Mike is able to work a lot of overtime during the main canning season. So they, it's kind of like a larder. They set aside money when he's able to work
Certain
all this
times of the
overtime
year.
during the year, and then they live on a little bit of that during the cooler months. And they feel lucky.
Matt Wopat was a GM worker and is a GM worker. He is what they call the GM gypsies. He's one of those, a Janesville gypsy. Tell us about the Wopat family, because this is some people know about this, but probably a lot of people don't know just how many people decided to continue working for the company, but at a different plant.
Right. So the Wopat is another multi-generational family. Marv Wopat is the guy who roared up to his granddaughter's high school graduation on the Harley. Mm-hmm. And he retired after 40 years the summer before the plant closed, just a few weeks before his son lost his job. So Matt also kind of waits around, and his father is saying to him, this plant is going to reopen. Just give it a little time. Just give it a little bit of time. It's always come back. And Matt believes it's kind of the common wisdom in town. But eventually, he too goes back to school in the exact same program that Jared Whittaker did to become a utility worker. And he sticks it out longer. He's doing pretty well. He's doing his homework at night with his daughters on the kitchen table after dinner. His daughter's coaching him on some of the math, but he's doing okay. And about 2/3 of the way through that year, an offer comes along from General Motors. And just to back up a minute, if you had been a GMer, not one of the supplier guys or women, but a GMer, and you had a lot of seniority, which most people in Janesville did, you had transfer rights to other plants that were hiring. So ever since the plant closed, people were getting offers to transfer to Arlington, Texas, which some people did, and outside Kansas City, which some people did, and plants in Michigan and Ohio. So these were the gypsies, and a few of these families moved, but many of them stayed rooted in Janesville. This is where their lives were. And the GM worker commuted these long, long distances, coming home if they could on weekends or once a month. It's pretty hard on families. Well, Matt is very close to his family. He also has 3 kids, 3 daughters, and he just said he was never going to be one of those gypsies. But at the point that this offer comes along, it was to work in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which, while about 300 miles away, was closer than any of the other offers, transfer offers, had been. And it is right around this point that his GM health benefits are going away, and he and his wife are becoming very concerned about whether they're going to lose their house. So he goes to his instructor with a bunch of the other GM guys who are in the same training program and says, look, if we stick it out through the end of the spring and get our degree, are there going to be jobs waiting for us? And the instructor levels with them and says, you know, the retirements that were supposed to be happening, those guys, whatever retirement income they have has been kind of decimated by the same bad economy that caused you to lose your job. They're not retiring so fast. So the odds of you getting a job around here doing what we're teaching you to do aren't so good. So Matt begins commuting to Fort Wayne, and he started in March of 2010. He's doing it to this day. He's got several more years until he's eligible for retirement. He leaves early every Monday morning. He works on second shift, which starts around 2:30 and goes till about 11 o'clock at night, depending whether there's overtime or not. And he and a bunch of other Janesville guys carpool home right after the second shift ends, get home in the middle of the night, Friday night, so he can sleep in his own bed.
And kiss his kids.
And kiss his kids.
Yeah.
Half a Friday night, Saturday and Sunday nights, and he's back on the road again to Indiana.
You said he plans to keep doing that until he's eligible for retirement.
Yeah. And he's a little unusual because many of the people who took these commuting jobs did so with maybe 3, 4, 5 years until they could see their pensions in front of them. And Matt was younger and had a lot of years to go. I think he had 15 years when he started until he was eligible for retirement, which is after 30 years with General Motors. But that's what he's doing, and it's kept his, I mean, this is the big trade-off, right? His family is a middle-class family. They've got GM benefits. He's got good vacation time, but he's working in Indiana with his kids at home.
You have to remember this is set against the backdrop of Wisconsin politics. So think about what was happening in Wisconsin in 2011, the Act 10 protests. Think about 2012, the recall election. I mentioned earlier that Janesville was this pretty tightly knit community with a certain civility, people all on the same page. What did the politics of Wisconsin, combined with the layoffs, do to this, I don't know, this sort of can-do attitude in Janesville? How did it play out?
Well, at one point in the story, I have this line that the kind of acrid politics of Madison spilled down the interstate to Janesville. And I think that's what happened. You know, there was one, you know, I tell this book, as you say, through these scenes involving people, these close-ups of various people in town, some of these workers and some other people in town whose perspectives I found interesting. And at one point in the story is the Labor Fest parade, and then State Senator Tim Cullen is marching in the parade as he does.
Democrat. Mm-hmm.
Democrat, as he's been doing for decades when he's been in office. And he looks over on the sidewalk, and there's a guy giving him the finger. And he just can't believe that this is what's happened in Janesville. So
that's because he left the state during the Act 10.
Well, he was never, I mean, I've asked him, what do you think that protest was about? And he's not been sure whether it was because he left the state during Act 10 or because he didn't fight hard enough. Yeah. But in that same Labor Fest parade is the beginning of the Occupy movement. And there were protesters who came in, some from other parts of Paul Ryan's district and some from elsewhere, union people who are coming in to stir up the Occupy movement in Wisconsin. And they're trailing Ryan all through the parade. So these public moments when you can see the civility cracking, but there were also private moments. I mean, there were family members not talking to family members over the recall or over, you know, debates about what should happen in town. And it was some of this increasingly polarized feel in town, I think, was associated with the debate about what should happen with the GM plant. The workers and union people and Democrats thought that the city should just hang on and that the plant would reopen. And many Republicans and the business leadership of the town, this group called Forward Janesville, that's like the Chamber of Commerce, were arguing that GM should sell off the property so it could be redeveloped. And there were really hard feelings around that division of opinion.
Yeah, people felt that it was time to move forward. Some
Yes.
people felt they couldn't
That was heresy, yeah.
Right, and they couldn't empathize with what the people who'd lost their jobs were going through.
Exactly, yeah.
Very interesting. Politicians, I would say, and I said this to Amy upstairs, I don't think, they may be the ones who don't fare all that well in your book. And it's not because you're out to nail politicians, you're just telling the story of what politicians were able to do to help the people of Janesville. And the fact of the matter was, Republicans and Democrats alike weren't really able to do much to help.
I think that's right. I mean, there were a lot of economic development efforts, but bringing jobs to town in a bad economy is a really hard thing to do.
And there were sort of promises made. I remember you begin early in the book, you talk about then candidate Obama visiting the plant and talking about a much brighter future.
Right.
And then you fast forward to him speaking at a Labor Day event, I think here in Milwaukee, talking about the comeback of the auto industry. And somehow the people in Janesville just didn't see that or feel that.
You know, early in my research, somebody had mentioned to me that then Senator candidate Obama in February of 2008 had given a big economic speech right inside the Janesville Assembly plant. He sort of laid out his campaign's economic agenda. So I found that on YouTube. And I just had goosebumps because there's this line in his speech in which he says, "The promise of Janesville is the promise of America." And that was in February of 2008. And no one knew at the time that December of 2008 that plant was going to close.
Let's talk for a moment about how Janesville is doing today. We look at the unemployment numbers, things look a lot better. How would you describe it?
Well, I think that there's never one view of the situation. So unemployment is down to about 4%, which is a huge drop.
It's over 13%.
It was over 13% this early spring of 2009, a few months after all these jobs vanished. So that looks pretty good. If you look at the pay that people are making, it's nothing like what they were making before. There are jobs paying maybe $14, $15 an hour that people are just clamoring for, and that says to me that if there's that kind of pent-up pressure in the community for those kind of jobs, that there's not a lot of jobs that are paying a lot more.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about a couple facets of this book that I found particularly interesting. One of them, and maybe it's because we live in a world now where we've seen the Foxconn incentives deal, $3 billion in incentives. But interestingly, in your book, we start to see the incentives era beginning. And we see it on a couple different levels. Talk a little bit about that, Amy, about what we saw in terms of efforts to hang on to some assembly line in Janesville.
Well, one of the reasons why there was so much denial when the announcement came the plant was going to close is because everybody in every layer of government said, we are going to fight hard and we are going to get another product into this plant. So then Governor Doyle, the Democrat who preceded the current governor, Walker, and the city of Janesville and the town of Beloit and the business leadership and the union leadership all got together to put together what was at the time a record offer of economic inducements to give to General Motors to try to win for the Janesville plant a new subcompact that GM was starting. And it was interesting because that was going to be the first subcompact that any U.S. automaker was making domestically. And Janesville turned out to be one of the finalists to get this little car. And they really thought they had this nailed. But it turned out that they did not offer nearly as much money as Michigan did. Michigan, I should point out, had an even higher unemployment rate at the time. So that state government had a huge motivation to put up just an enormous amount of money. And that little car is being made in Orion, Michigan, not in Janesville.
I think you were saying that Governor Doyle at the time, I think it was $195 million
Yes.
you say in the book. And the governor was absolutely adamant that this was the best offer they got. I'm sure we were better. And then he finds out that Michigan spent like $1 billion, 5 times as much as he offered.
Right, because they were secret bids, so nobody knew what anybody else was offering. And it was just unimaginable to the governor that anyone could have put up more money, but turned out to be the case.
And then we see the incentives theme reemerge as Janesville tries to recreate itself. There's a medical technology company that is thinking about opening, and they find Janesville to be a lucrative site. So Janesville has to make a decision on whether they're going to offer this company money. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, this company is called Shine Medical, and it was out of kind of the research engine in Madison. And this little bitty startup had come up with a new way of making a medical isotope that's in demand. And there were a number of communities around Wisconsin that were competing to become the manufacturing home of this new little company called Shine. And this took on, kind of a larger-than-life symbolic importance in Janesville. It wasn't going to be that many jobs, at most maybe 150 jobs. But the best of those jobs were going to be well paid, about $50,000 a year. And it became this big contentious issue before the Janesville City Council whether to approve a package of economic incentives that the city bureaucracy had put together. And it was approved. It's the most money at the time that Janesville ever offered to get.
Like $9 million?
$9 million for a city that was not in good shape economically at the time, financially at the time. And Shine at the time was facing a very cumbersome federal approval process. There were environmental regulations, safety regulations, all kinds of federal hurdles that this little startup had to go through to get to the point at which it could get a license to try to generate the capital to start manufacturing. And over the intervening years, it actually has gotten those federal approvals. And manufacturing hasn't started, but in the last period of months, and again, symbolic move, the company located its headquarters from just south of Madison to a main intersection along Main Street in Janesville. And the psychological effect of Shine and all this money that went to lure it to town really can't be overestimated. I mean, I would be back in town and I would talk to people about, what's your sense of how things are going? And people would say, they're going great, Shine is coming.
Symbolic. Yeah.
It was symbolic, but at quite a cost. And it's sort of, these are precursors to, Foxconn, which is sort of being writ large now. But it's the exact same debate about what it's worth a community investing, or a state investing, a government of any tier investing, to try to bring jobs in.
Another part of the book that's fascinating, and this prompts a much larger discussion, is about the notion of retraining. When there are layoffs, that's sort of the mantra. We'll get people back to school, they'll learn a new career, and they'll find new success in the next chapter of their life. A lot of people who were laid off at the GM assembly plant went back to school. They went to Black Hawk Tech. They tried to train and get new skills so they could prepare for the next part of their lives. How did that work out?
Well, for people like Mike Vaughn, it worked out pretty well, but that was not the common experience. So revealing my inner nerd, I'll tell you that. I worked with a couple of labor economists to get together some data to look at how people turned out who had been laid off and either did or did not go back to Black Hawk Tech to retrain. And we got data from the college and from the state's Department of Workforce Development, put together all these data sets. And the bottom line of this analysis was quite sobering. It turns out that counterintuitively, people who had gone back to school, this was by 2011, so a few years after all these jobs vanished, were less likely to be working all 4 seasons of the year. The gap between their pay before the recession and afterwards was larger. It just was not working out for a lot of people.
That surprised you?
Well, it surprised me at first. but there's a but to the surprise. One is that there's not a lot of research literature on job retraining. A lot of states have not been comfortable sharing the kind of data you need for researchers to do this kind of analysis. But the little bits of data that do, research data that do exist really suggest similar findings. So it's not surprising in that regard. But in terms of Janesville, there may be many reasons why job retraining wasn't automatically a road to success. But I think the bottom line fact is that by the time people finished programs, if they finished, and most people did not finish their retraining, but if they did finish, jobs were not coming back at the rate that people had expected based on the precedent from other US recessions. So one of the people whose experiences run through the story is a guy named Bob Borman, who was running the job center in Janesville. And, I had many conversations with him about this, and he ended up feeling like they had done good work, but that he was a little guilty because he had encouraged all kinds of people who were coming through the job center to use this very readily available federal money for tuition and other expenses to go back to school, not imagining that jobs were not going to be coming back in time. And it just was beyond what people have been able to foresee.
I'm going to take questions here in just a moment. One final question for you, Amy, in this part of the program. What's the future of the GM assembly plant site? What's going to happen to that?
Well, the future is sort of hanging in the balance in real time. For years, and this was yet another reason why there was so much denial in town, the Janesville assembly plant was in a status within GM called standby. That meant that nothing was happening at the plant, but it was eligible to be reopened if the market demand ever warranted it. And for a few years, it was the only plant in all of General Motors that was in that limbo status. But in the last GM UAW contract in 2015, the plant was officially closed. So Janesville the city has been trying to find a buyer for this immense piece of property. And earlier this year, the city announced that there were 4 potentially interested companies. And now there's one company out of St. Louis, a company that specialized in distressed industrial properties, that's made an offer quite recently to buy this plant. So it's not clear whether the offer is going to go through. It'll become clear in the next couple of months. And the city manager has said in the last few weeks that if this all materializes, the plant, which has been there since the early part of the 20th century, could be raised within a bit more than a year.
Interesting. I want to take a couple questions from the audience. We're going to do something a little different today, which we will in just a moment. But if you're in the seating bowl, I think you know the drill. Please press down on the rim, not on the ball. Keep your finger down on the rim. We'll be able to hear your question. If you're in the back, Ryan has a microphone. He will come over, stand next to you, hold it, and you can ask a question. We only ask that you keep your remarks fairly brief. We're interested in questions and not speeches, as I always say at these events. So you're really anxious. You just can't wait. So you get the first question.
What has not been mentioned is that it became non-cool to buy an American-made car by many people, even though the economics were. So is there any comments on why people stopped buying GM and Ford products because European cars and Japanese cars were cooler or better made?
Yeah, so I think that coolness factor had crept into U.S. culture quite a while before the events that I'm looking at. And there are probably a lot of factors. But the market for SUVs was pretty good for a while, and then it stopped. So I don't think it's just the coolness factor, but I think it's the coolness factor and then this really bad economic time that did in the Janesville assembly plant.
When you're selling Tahoes, I would imagine, the mileage is not good and you're spending a lot on gas. If you don't have
Absolutely.
money, it's hard to buy a Tahoe. Sure.
You got me thinking back at Kenosha and American Motors and wondering if there's any similarity there. And then looking forward at Foxconn, could it be the same thing in 50 years from now or whatever?
Is your crystal ball ready for that one?
Yeah, I'm not that good a prophet. I'm better at looking at what's happened. But, one thing that I have done is talk to people in Janesville about whether they think Foxconn will be beneficial for Rock County's economy. And what a couple people have pointed out to me is that if you think about how Wisconsin's highway system runs, main roadways are north-south. So having suppliers for Foxconn basically having to go through Lake Geneva to get to Rock County, people thought was not that likely. So, time will have to tell, how's that for a dodge, whether Foxconn proves economically beneficial to Wisconsin and warrants the investment the state has offered. But the likelihood, I think, that it would be helpful to Janesville itself is probably not that strong.
I think the other part of the question, too, is about, you mentioned AMC, American Motors, and kind of a similar story played out in Kenosha and in cities all around the country.
Right, and that really is the large point of why I did this work. I wanted to tell a story that would be a microcosm that people could identify with in many communities. And I'll tell you, I've done a lot of radio interviews in recent months talking about this book. And one of them was a call-in show late in the spring in which people all over the country were describing their own community's loss of jobs. And it just felt like this job loss ballet I was hearing. Somebody in Florida calling in about the loss of the fishing industry, and somebody in Maine about the loss of the shoe industry, and somebody from Appalachia about the loss of coal jobs. And that's why I wrote this book, thinking that the sort of close-up experiences of what really happens to one set of people when work goes away would be relevant, I hope, to people who had nothing to do with Southeast Wisconsin, nothing to do with the auto industry, but maybe could identify with what really happens when good work goes away.
Let me take other questions. Anybody in the back? Anybody up there have a question? Yes, sir.
Can you tell a little bit what happened to Parker Fenn?
Yeah, so Parker had its own sort of industrial trajectory. It was going a few decades before General Motors arrived, as I said before. And it stayed in the Parker family for, I think, 4 generations. And then it was sold and sold and sold again. And the final iteration, it was no longer in the factory that had been the Parker factory for a very, very long time. It had moved to smaller quarters in Janesville. And the last set of workers for the kind of heirs of Parker Pen, not heirs in the family, but the worker heirs, weren't even manufacturing pens. They were putting labels on pens that had been made out of the country. And those jobs ended in 2010.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes? I'm going to go back there and then I'll come down to you. So right behind you first.
Did the people who lost their jobs in 2008, did they retain their retirement funds, or did they retain any health benefits from GM?
So there were these unemployment benefits that lasted for a couple of years, the so-called sub-pay. And there were health benefits that lasted a while. Getting to the point of pensions, 30 years, is why some of these people have taken jobs in the sort of diaspora, these gypsies. But if you were not eligible for retirement at the time the jobs ended, you couldn't get a pension. There were also a series of buyouts. I didn't mention when I was talking about the Whitaker family that Jared Whitaker decided at one point to take a buyout, which really meant that even if the plant reopened, he would have had a chance at that job, but no GM jobs elsewhere. It was a pretty bad buyout offer. It was a couple $1,000s. But the reason he did it at the time was it came with 6 extra months of health benefits for his family. At the time, he was working a job that didn't come with any health insurance. So for that little extension on his family's health insurance, he took a buyout that basically severed his relationship with General Motors.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
There are a couple of pretty famous politicians from
Janesville named Feingold and Ryan, opposite parties, and I believe both were in office in '08 when the plant shut down. Does your book address the efforts that each man took and how they contrasted or compared and level of success? Apparently no success, but what they did to address the situation of their constituents losing jobs en masse.
Yeah, so when we were talking a little bit before about this big effort to try to attract a new product to the Janesville Assembly Plant, both those politicians were very involved in that effort. I mean, the entire delegation, Senate, Congress, Democrat, Republican, they were all in trying to persuade General Motors to favor Janesville with this new product. Paul Ryan had the closest relationships with the leadership of General Motors of any of these people. And he was, for a while, quite active, and his staff was quite active in talking with them, trying to be persuasive. There's one scene fairly early in the story when a delegation goes to Detroit to kind of make the pitch that with the very top, close to the very top leadership of General Motors, that Janesville warrants this new product. And Paul Ryan was there. I don't think that Russ Feingold was there on that trip, but he was also involved in this effort.
This book sort of begins with Paul Ryan when he gets the call that tells him, hey, the plant's going to close.
And the announcement's going to be tomorrow. And it's because he had a close relationship with people in the leadership of General Motors that he got that heads-up call.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
We seem to have become accustomed to more than half of our budget going to the military, which we don't really even talk about. And recently, an $80 billion increase in the Pentagon budget was approved by both of our senators here in Wisconsin, with really no discussion about that. And if the American people could begin to demand that the money that the value we create in our taxpayer dollars goes to fund, say, rebuilding infrastructure, some kind of, the kind of renewal that FDR created in this country. What can people do to change the conversation so that we begin to think about those possibilities?
So what I was hoping to do in this book is not to lay out any policy prescriptions, but to get people to think. So I've just had a success.
That's good, yeah. Sure. Yeah, just hang on 1 second. We'll get a microphone over to you.
So you mentioned that your goal was to get people to think, and it's clear from watching the audience from the back that a lot of people are nodding their heads and saying that they do understand kind of and empathize with the individuals in Janesville and their situation. You mentioned at the beginning that you were covering healthcare right now for the Post. Do you plan on doing a similar ethnographic work about people who are struggling in the light of healthcare issues?
So that's part of my day job. And it's a pretty intense job right now. So I've been very focused on what's been happening in Washington, the political debate, both between the parties and within the Republican Party over the Affordable Care Act and its future or lack thereof. But whenever I can, I try to get into communities and write about what it looks like to have parts of the healthcare system hurting. I did a story, for instance, last spring out of West Tennessee, where a lot of rural hospitals were closing and looking at what that meant to those communities. So, yeah, that's part of my professional mission.
Can you pass the microphone right over to him? Yeah.
Thank you. Could you talk about the qualities in Janesville that made it the good and the bad with regard to the community rallying behind the closing and helping out the workers?
I'm sorry, what's the last thing you said? The good and bad rallying around?
The workers, the displaced workers. What made Janesville good and bad for what happened with the GM plant?
Well, as we were talking about, I think I didn't know this about Janesville when I picked it. And I picked it for a lot of reasons, because it had lost a lot of jobs and because it had never before been part of the Rust Belt. So I was interested in being able to show what this bad economic time had yielded and not about kind of an accumulation of economic decay over the decades. But I learned that Janesville turns out to have been a pretty resilient place during this very hard economic time it was going through. And there were coalitions of a couple different kinds that were formed by people in the community to try to figure out what to do. There was one group called CORD, which was formed by the guy who was running the job center. That was a coalition of a lot of nonprofits in the area to try to make sure that they weren't duplicating services when there was so much demand for all their services. That formed pretty quickly. It came together the fall of 2008. Once it was clear the plant was closing by the end of that year, that coalition was already going. It was very active for a few years. There's also, among the business leadership of the area, a group called Rock County 5.0 that formed. And the leaders were a woman named Mary Wilmer. She's remarried, so she's got a different last name now, but she was the main banker in town. And a woman named Diane Hendricks, who you may be familiar with, who is a very affluent woman who runs ABC Supply out of Beloit. And they were trying to bring other jobs into the area. And the thing that was so striking was that you might think that was a no-brainer to have people within the same county pooling their business acumen to try to bring a new job. But these two cities have been rivals for a long time. So the fact that they came together to try to work collaboratively on bringing in jobs was something that was quite new.
I'm going to wrap things up right there, and we're going to do things a little differently, so hang with me for just a second here. First of all, I want to mention that our next event is tomorrow. It is sold out. It's with the Senior Vice President of the Bucks, Alex Lassery. Kind of an interesting young guy, and the Bucks are doing some very interesting things in terms of the arena project regarding the workforce, and he'll be talking about that and also about sort of his take on Milwaukee. He's a newcomer to this city. He's a millennial. He's got some ideas about what we're doing right and things we might do better. So that's tomorrow. You can watch it online, law.marquette.edu. You can actually watch it. We'll have a conference on Tuesday. We'll be kicking off the new Lubar Center here at Marquette University Law School. We're looking forward to that. We'll also be, in addition to launching the Lubar Center, we will be unveiling our newest project here at the law school, a new initiative called MAP. It's the Milwaukee Area Project. We'll be focusing especially on the 5-county Milwaukee area with both polling and data analysis. So that's coming up on Tuesday. Also, please check our website for more programs coming up. We've added a few towards the end of the semester. One other thing, Amy's book will be for sale out in the lobby. So you can, if you're interested and want to buy a copy, you can buy one there. Amy will be glad to sign it. And we're going to end today with Amy actually reading from the book. And we're going to go back to Matt Wopat. This is the GM gypsy, the guy who commutes from Janesville to Fort Wayne every single week. Amy?
So this is a bit of a chapter called Night Drive about Matt's ride home at the end of his work week. And I've been asked this before, so the answer is yes, I was in the back seat. Come on, get the hell out of here, a guy shouts as he bursts out the door and speed walks across the terracotta tiled lobby, barely slowing to slide his ID card through the punch clock. Friday night at the Fort Wayne assembly plant, the end of the work week, the end of second shift, a 9-hour shift today with a lucky hour's overtime. So there's 11:45 p.m. as this guy is shouting, one guy among 1,100 GMers pouring off the factory floor to start the weekend. Amid this horde, Matt Wopat reaches the lobby at 11:47 p.m., wearing a knit cap, a backpack slung over one shoulder. He is not running, but he too is walking very, very fast, a Friday night ritual. He reaches the chilly night air, and a coworker wishes him a safe drive tonight. He stops for an instant at the 97 Saturn, which he parks in the same part of the vast lot every Friday, in the middle row under a street lamp, so that he won't have to think about where he's left his car where he turns on Monday. He pulls his duffel from the trunk and continues walking very, very fast over to a nearby 2003 Pontiac Grand Prix already idling. In the driver's seat is Chris Aldridge, In the back seat, his coat crunched up between him and the door, is Paul Sheridan. Janesville GM gypsies both. Chris pops the trunk for Matt to toss his duffel inside and slam the trunk shut before he gets in on the passenger side. Matt's door is barely closed when Chris guns the engine and roars off. 280 miles to go, 4 hours and 35 minutes, speeding just a little where they're pretty sure they will not get caught. Matt pulls out his phone, calls Darcy to tell her they are leaving, same as he does every week. When Chris guns the engine, it's 11:54 p.m. in Fort Wayne, except that Matt is not the only one who stays on Janesville time. So the dashboard on the Grand Prix says 10:54. Chris started working at Fort Wayne on August 17, 2009, 7 months before Matt. Chris will never forget that day. His wife and kid along to help him move, except that he doesn't like to say he has moved, so he says he stays at Fort Wayne. Anyhow, his family left on Monday morning when he went to the plant for orientation, which was during first shift, so he was back in his new apartment by 3:30 that afternoon, and he sat on a chair from a cheap dinette set they had just gotten, staring at a wall. Alone, his family and kids already back in Janesville, one of the worst feelings of his life. That was 3.5 years ago. The Grand Prix had 47,000 miles on it. Now it has 134,407. On this night, they are not yet 10 minutes from the plant, about to turn onto Route 114, when Matt says in his quiet way, "This is my 3-year anniversary." Chris doesn't miss a beat. "We aren't going to celebrate that," he says. Matt already texted Darcy before going to work, "Happy anniversary to me, 3 years." And the reply came back, "Has it been 3 years? Seems a lot longer." Darcy had added a sad face emoticon. Thank you.
Again, the name of the book is Janesville, An American Story. Thanks so much for being with us today, and thanks to Amy Goldstein.